The zip ties were too tight. That was the first thing Marcus Drell noticed when he opened his right eye. Not the cold, not the smell of concrete and machine oil, not the two men standing near the door with their arms crossed and their faces arranged into the particular expression that men wear when they have been told to wait and don't like waiting. The zip ties were too tight, and they had been too tight for long enough that his hands had gone from painful to numb, which meant he had been here for at least 3 hours, probably more. He did not panic. Panic was a thing Marcus had trained out of himself over a very long period of time and at considerable personal cost. He had stood in freezing water until instructors told him to get out. He had gone days without sleep while carrying weight that would have ended most men. He had been put in rooms not unlike this one, as part of exercises designed to simulate exactly this kind of situation, and he had sat in those rooms and done the same thing he was doing now. He counted. He counted the ceiling tiles, 12 across, 9 deep. He counted the seconds between the footsteps of the man nearest the door, roughly 4, which meant the man was restless, which meant this situation was not as controlled on their end as they wanted it to appear. He counted the number of light sources, 1 overhead fluorescent, 1 lamp near the far wall with a cracked shade, and he mapped where the shadows fell, and which corners of the room those shadows made deeper than they needed to be. He was 41 years old. He had been a Navy SEAL for 17 years. He had operated in 8 countries across 3 continents, in conditions ranging from extreme heat to temperatures that left frost on his beard. He had never once, in all of that time, been brought somewhere against his will by men who were supposed to be on his side. That was the part that was still finding its shape in his mind when the door opened. The man who walked in was not military. Marcus knew this the way a carpenter knows bad wood, not from one thing but from the accumulated reading of 100 small things at once. The way the man held himself said private sector. The way he dressed said someone was paying him well. The way he looked at Marcus said he had done this before, and the before had ended in ways that gave him a kind of confidence Marcus did not respect. "Chief Petty Officer," the man said. His accent was mid-Atlantic, polished, the kind that belongs to someone who grew up in one place and worked very hard to sound like they grew up somewhere else. Marcus said nothing. "You don't need to say anything right now," the man said. "We have time." He pulled a chair from near the wall and sat down in front of Marcus with the ease of someone settling in for a long conversation about nothing in particular. He set a thin folder on the floor beside the chair and rested his hands on his knees. "There is a set of coordinates," the man said, "and a name attached to those coordinates. We need both confirmed. That's it. That's the whole thing. You confirm them, and this becomes a very short and unremarkable evening." Marcus looked at the crack in the lampshade. It ran diagonally from the lower rim toward the center, like a river on a map, and the light coming through it threw a thin, bright line across the near wall. "I see," the man said, in the tone of someone who was not surprised. He stood, picked up the folder, and left. The 2 men near the door did not follow him out. What happened in the next several hours is the kind of thing that is easier to describe from the outside than the inside. Marcus Drell had been trained to manage pain. He had been trained to compartmentalize, to separate the body's signals from the mind's processing, to file what was happening to his physical self into a drawer and keep that drawer closed while the rest of him stayed functional. That training held. It held longer than the men in the room seemed to expect, which he could tell from the way their patience changed texture and became something else entirely. He gave them nothing. This was not stubbornness. It was not ego. It was a simple and clean decision he had made at some point in his first hour in this room, before the man in the polished accent arrived, before the 2 men near the door came close enough to matter, and having made it, he did not revisit it. Marcus Drell did not go back on decisions. It was possibly the most consistent thing about him. He had grown up in a small town in Ohio. His mother had worked at a pharmacy. His father had left when Marcus was 9, and Marcus had filed that information in a drawer, and closed it, and the drawer had stayed closed for 32 years. He had played high school football poorly and run track better. He had been accepted to 2 colleges and chosen neither. He had enlisted instead, and the Navy had recognized in him something that the recruiters probably could not have put into words, a quality of stillness under pressure that was not passivity, but its opposite. A man who got quieter the more urgent things became. That quality had served him in places no one would ever know about. It served him here. At some point, he believed it was close to dawn based on a thin change in the quality of air coming through the ventilation. The man with the polished accent came back. He stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at Marcus with an expression that was not quite respect and not quite frustration, but lived in the narrow space between those two things. "You are making this harder than it needs to be," the man said. Marcus looked at the crack in the lampshade. The man left again. An hour later, Marcus heard a vehicle outside. Then footsteps, different footsteps, more of them, moving with a different kind of purpose. Then voices, low and quick, the sound of men giving and receiving information rapidly. Then the door opened for the third time, and this time, it was not the man with the polished accent. It was 4 men in unmarked gear, and they were very clearly not here for the same reason as everyone else who had been in this room. 2 of them went directly to the men near the wall. The other 2 came to Marcus. One of them pulled a blade and cut the zip ties without a word. Marcus's hands dropped, and the return of blood into his fingers was intense, in a way that took his full attention for approximately 30 seconds, which was exactly the amount of attention he could spare. Then they were moving, and the building was behind them, and it was early morning and the air was cold and Marcus Drell was alive. He did not know yet, lying in the back of the vehicle with a field dressing on his shoulder and his eyes on the ceiling above him, that this was not over. He did not know that the vehicle was heading toward a forward aid station 2 hours away. He did not know the name of the woman who ran triage there. He did not know that she had already been told he was coming. He did not know how she had been told, or who had told her, or what exactly the person who gave her that information had said when they explained what she would be receiving. He did not know that she had listened to all of it, said nothing for a moment that lasted long enough to be uncomfortable, and then said, in a voice that gave nothing away at all, "Tell me his blood type." He did not know any of that. He was working on staying conscious, which was taking most of his energy, and he was doing the thing he always did, in situations that required endurance rather than action. He was counting the rivets in the ceiling of the vehicle, the turns, the seconds between them. He was at 147 when the vehicle stopped. He was at 148 when the back doors opened and the light came in, and with it, voices, movement, the organized noise of people who knew what to do and were doing it. He registered a face above him, a woman, dark eyes, an expression he could not immediately classify, focused in a way that was not quite medical and not quite something else but held elements of both. She said 4 words. "Don't move your shoulder." He didn't. And somewhere in the part of Marcus Drell's mind that stayed active even when everything else was running on minimum power, the part that had counted ceiling tiles and rivets and footsteps in the dark for the last several hours, something registered about those 4 words. Not what they said, but how they were said. Like someone who already knew exactly what she was looking at. Like someone who had seen this kind of damage before. Not in a textbook, not in a training exercise. Before. He filed it, closed the drawer. Let the darkness come up the way it had been threatening to for the last 2 hours, patient and inevitable as weather. The last thing he heard before it did was the sound of equipment being moved with quiet, precise efficiency, and the low voice of the woman giving instructions to someone nearby, calm and specific and carrying in it the particular authority of someone who has never once in their life needed to raise their voice to be taken seriously. He would think about that voice later. There would be time. Elena Vasquez had been awake for 31 hours when the unmarked vehicle pulled up to the aid station, and the 31 hours mattered in the way that all long hours matter. They stripped everything down to what was actually essential. There was no room, at hour 31, for anything that wasn't necessary. She had learned this early, back when she was still working civilian trauma in a city hospital that processed more critical cases per night than most military units saw in a month. She had learned that exhaustion, if you let it, became a kind of clarity. It burned away the noise. What remained was only what you were actually made of. What Elena Vasquez was made of had surprised people before. She was 34 years old. She stood 5 feet 6 inches and had the kind of face that people remembered as pleasant, without being able to say exactly why. She wore her dark hair pulled back with the efficiency of someone who had made peace with practicality a long time ago. She had been working in forward operating aid stations for 2 years, attached to a medical support unit whose designation she would give if asked. and whose actual function she would describe accurately, only up to a point. Nobody usually asked past that point. People who worked in places like this understood that there were layers, and that asking about the layers too directly was considered poor form. Elena understood layers better than most. The night her current shift had started, a colleague named Patrick had handed her a coffee and said, in the tone of someone sharing mildly interesting news, that things were going to stay quiet. He had been saying this at the beginning of every shift for 3 weeks. He was wrong with a consistency that Elena found almost admirable. By hour 6, they had taken in a corporal with a shrapnel wound to the upper leg, a specialist with an infection in her left hand that had progressed to the point where another 12 hours would have made things significantly worse, and a lieutenant who had managed to fracture his wrist in a manner that suggested he had been doing something he was not supposed to be doing and had no interest in explaining what. By hour 14, 2 more cases. By hour 22, a chest injury that required more of her attention than anything else that night, and left her standing at a supply cabinet at 3 in the morning, taking stock of what she had used and calculating what she needed to request in the morning. Patrick found her there and handed her a second coffee. Still quiet, he said. Patrick, she said, you are genuinely the worst predictor of events I have ever met. He took this as the compliment she somewhat intended it to be. By hour 30, the pace had slowed enough that she had allowed herself to sit for 20 minutes. She had taken her boots off, which was something she rarely did during a shift, and was reading a letter from her younger sister in Colorado, the one who taught elementary school and sent long, warm, detailed updates about children whose names Elena was beginning to know the way she knew the names of regular patients, when the radio crackled. Not the general channel, the secondary one. Elena put the letter down very carefully. She reached for the handset with the same deliberateness she brought to everything, and she listened to what was said, and then she asked the question that established immediately how her mind had processed the information. Tell me his blood type. There was a brief pause on the other end, then, a positive. She was already moving before she said, how long? 2 hours out, maybe less. What do I need to prepare for? What followed was a description that she listened to in full, filing each detail with the part of her brain that was a triage nurse, and simultaneously processing with a separate part, a part that had a different kind of training attached to it, the implications of what was being described. Not just the injuries, the pattern of the injuries. When the voice on the other end finished, she said, who else is coming with him? 4-man extraction team. They're clean. They'll hand him off and go. And after that? After that, he's yours. She put the handset down and stood still for 3 seconds. This was something she did when she needed to transition from one mode of operating to another. 3 seconds of complete stillness, a practice she had developed not in nursing school but in a different kind of school entirely, in a place with red dirt and high altitude, and instructors who understood the value of controlled breathing in a way that had nothing to do with meditation. Then she moved. She woke the night aide, a young man named Owen who was competent and calm and did not ask unnecessary questions, which were the 3 qualities she most needed from him. She gave him a brief list of preparations. He nodded and disappeared. She prepared the bay herself. She checked the equipment with the specific attention of someone who knows which detail, overlooked, becomes the critical failure point. She checked it twice, not because she doubted herself the first time, but because twice was the standard she held, always, without exception, regardless of how tired she was. She was thinking about the pattern. The information she had been given on the radio described injuries that were consistent with a particular method, a method she recognized not from any nursing text but from a document she had seen once, in a building she had never officially been inside, during a period of her life she did not discuss. The document had been a debrief summary. It had described, in the flat, affectless language of official reporting, a set of techniques used by a category of private contractors operating in gray zones, outside the reach of military law, outside the reach of most accountability structures, in the space that exists when governments need things done that governments cannot be seen doing. She had read that document and felt something very cold settle in her chest. She felt it again now, because the man who was being brought to her had not been taken by enemies. This was the part that required her to keep her expression entirely neutral as she completed her preparations. Because she was not alone in the station. and because what she was thinking, if visible on her face, would require explanations she was not prepared to give. The man had been taken by people who were supposed to be protecting him. She knew this because of the pattern of the injuries. She knew this because of the type of facility described. She knew this because of the specific combination of details that, to anyone without her particular background, would have looked like a bad situation in a dangerous place. To her, they spelled something more specific. She was still thinking about it when she heard the vehicle. The four-man team that brought him in were exactly what she'd been told. Clean, efficient, professional in the way of people who take their work seriously and have strong feelings about doing it correctly. They transferred him with care. They gave her a verbal summary that matched what she had been told on the radio, and one of them, a man named Garrett, with the steady eyes of someone who has had long practice at staying calm, looked at her for a moment before he turned to leave. "You've got this," he said. It was not quite a statement and not quite a question. "Yes," she said, just the one word. He nodded and left, and the doors closed, and she was alone with Marcus Drell and Owen and the quiet of the bay. She looked at the man on the table. He was unconscious, which was probably a mercy given the shape he was in. He was broad-shouldered and lean in the way of someone who had spent a long time making his body into a tool rather than a statement. His face was damaged enough that she could not read it clearly yet, but the structure of it, the jaw, the brow, suggested someone accustomed to looking at things without flinching. She began her assessment. Owen moved beside her, handing things before she asked for them, which was the particular gift of a good aide. She worked through the assessment with full attention, cataloging each injury, establishing the severity, the order of priority, the sequence of intervention. She kept her voice even. She kept her hands steady. And she kept thinking about the pattern. Because there was one other thing she knew, beyond the nursing, and beyond what the debrief document had told her. There was one other thing she had brought into this room that neither Garrett nor Owen, nor anyone else in this station could have guessed. She knew what this kind of work looked like from both sides. Not because she had heard about it, not because she had studied it. Because there had been a time she had filed in a drawer that she kept very firmly closed, when she had been asked to do work that operated in exactly the space these contractors occupied. Not the same work, a different kind, a kind that required stillness and patience and the ability to hold a single point of focus for longer than most people could manage. A kind that required the ability to look at a situation from a distance, assess it entirely, and then make a decision that could not be taken back. She had been good at it. That was the plain fact of the matter. She had been very, very good at it. And then she had made her own decision, a decision that also could not be taken back. And she had walked away from that part of her life and become a nurse instead. She had thought, at the time, that the two things were separate, that she had put one down in order to pick up the other. She was beginning to think, standing in this bay at hour 31, of a shift that had long since ceased to feel like a single shift, that she had been wrong about that. That maybe the two things had been moving toward each other all along. She stabilized Marcus Drell's shoulder. She addressed the most urgent issues in order of priority. She directed Owen with calm precision. She worked for 2 hours without stopping, and at the end of those 2 hours, the man on the table was in significantly better condition than he had been when he arrived, and she was reasonably confident he was going to stay that way. Owen went to log the case. She stood alone for a moment in the bay. She looked at Marcus Drell's hands, the marks on his wrists where the restraints had been, the specific nature of the injury to his left side, the patterning of it all, laid out for her like a language she had not spoken in years but had never forgotten. She understood what had been done to him. She understood who had done it, in the broad sense. Not the names, not yet, but the category of person, the type of organization, the set of circumstances that produced this kind of outcome. And she understood something else. This was not over. The people who had done this had not simply released him. He had been extracted, which meant someone had known where he was. And if someone had known where he was, then the people who had put him there either already knew he was gone or would know very soon, which meant that whoever had brought him here, to this station, to her care, had made a decision that came with a set of consequences that had not finished arriving yet. She looked at the door of the bay, then she looked at Marcus Drell. She reached for her chart and began writing the official record of his injuries, using the language of medical documentation, precise and clean, and containing none of what she actually knew. And somewhere in the back of her mind, in the place where she had learned to do quiet calculations during 11 months of training on red dirt at high altitude, she was already doing a different kind of assessment. Not of his injuries, of the situation, of what was coming next, of what she was going to have to do about it. The man who walked through the aid station door at 3:47 in the morning was not a patient. Elena had been a nurse long enough to know the difference immediately. It lived in the posture. A patient arrives carrying their own damage, all their attention turned inward toward the thing hurting them. This man arrived carrying attention turned outward, watchful, cataloging. He was in civilian clothing, but the clothing was too considered, too practical, with too many pockets in too many useful places. He had the build of someone who stayed in shape for functional rather than aesthetic reasons. He spoke to Patrick at the front intake, and even from across the room, Elena could read the exchange without hearing it. Patrick's body language went from welcoming to slightly uncertain. The man handed over something, a card, a document, she couldn't see which, and Patrick looked at it, and his uncertainty did not resolve into comfort the way it would if the documentation were entirely in order. Elena set down her chart. She did not move toward the exchange. She watched it. The man asked something. Patrick answered and gestured toward the back, toward the bay. Elena looked down at her chart and began writing again. Her handwriting did not change. Her pen moved at the same pace, but she was no longer thinking about what she was writing. She was thinking about how long she had before the man made his way to the back of the station. Approximately 2 minutes, given the layout. Possibly less if Patrick walked him directly. She used those 2 minutes. She moved to the supply cabinet along the far wall, a route that naturally took her past Marcus Drell's bay, and she paused at the curtain. She did not go in. She simply checked, from the gap in the curtain, that he was still unconscious, and that his vitals monitor was reading what she needed it to read. He was. It was. She moved on to the supply cabinet and was counting bandage stock when the man appeared at the entrance to the ward. He moved through the ward the way someone moves through a place they want you to think they have authority to be in. There is a specific quality to that kind of movement. It is slightly too smooth, slightly too confident, like a song being played in a key that is almost right. Elena recognized it because she had used it herself. He stopped when he reached her. "You're the attending nurse?" "One of them," she said. She did not look up from her count. "I need to check on one of your current patients. He was brought in a few hours ago. No official intake paperwork." "A few of our patients come in without paperwork," she said. "We're a forward station. It happens." This one in particular. He described Marcus's general physical profile, height, approximate age, the nature of some of the injuries. Elena made a small note on her clipboard. "Okay," she said. "He's not able to receive visitors. He's been delirious since he came in. Infection, on top of the other injuries. We're managing it, but he's not coherent." She finally looked up. "You family?" The man's expression did not change. "No." "Then I can't let you in the bay. Patient privacy and medical stability. You can speak to our station commander in the morning. She'll be in at 0700. There was a pause. The man was reading her the same way she was reading him, and they both knew it, and neither of them acknowledged it. "Has he said anything?" the man asked, during the lucid moments. "He asked for water," Elena said. "He said a woman's name I didn't recognize. After that, nothing I could make sense of." Another pause, shorter this time. "I'll come back in the morning," the man said. "The commander will be happy to help you," Elena said. He left. She waited until she heard the outer door close. Then she moved back through the ward quickly, into the bay, and stood beside the bed. Marcus Drell was awake. He had been awake, she understood, for some portion of the last exchange. He was looking at the ceiling with the specific focused blankness of someone who is performing unconsciousness and doing a reasonably good job of it. His vital signs on the monitor had not changed during the conversation, not by a single point. Whatever control he had over his own physiological responses was, she thought, genuinely remarkable. She checked his IV line. She adjusted the rate of flow. She leaned slightly closer and said, in a voice calibrated to carry no further than the foot between her mouth and his ear, "He'll be back." "Not at 7, earlier." Marcus said nothing. She straightened. She wrote something in his chart. She left the bay with the unhurried movement of someone who has simply completed a routine check. Back at her station, she sat down. Owen was asleep in the break room. Patrick was at the front desk. The ward was quiet. She picked up her pen and went back to the chart she had been filling out. And she began, in the margins, in a notation system that resembled standard medical shorthand but was not, to write down everything she had observed about the man who had just left. His height, his approximate weight, the way he had held his left arm slightly away from his body, an old injury, she thought, possibly a shoulder, the make of his boots, the positioning of the items in his pockets, the bulk and shape of each, visible against the fabric under the ward lights. She wrote it all down in small, precise notation. Then she tore the margin off the chart, folded it into a very small square, and placed it in the inner pocket of her jacket. She went back to her official documentation. Her handwriting remained consistent. Her pulse rate, had anyone been measuring it, would have told them nothing at all. The night outside the station was very quiet, the kind of quiet that happens between things. She worked through it, and she waited, and she thought about the 3 phone calls she needed to make before 6 in the morning, and the order in which she needed to make them, and exactly what she was going to say. It was not the first time she had planned under pressure in a room where someone nearby did not know what she was thinking. It would not, she suspected, be the last. There is a version of Elena Vasquez that the world had been allowed to see, and it was not false. That was the important thing. Every credential she carried was real. Every hour she had logged in trauma units and forward stations had been genuine work, genuinely done. The people she had helped, the ones who had come to her bleeding, frightened, in pain, had received real care from someone who was actually, fully present for them. She had not pretended to be a nurse. She had become one. The question, which she had spent a long time sitting with, was whether becoming something new canceled out what you had been before, whether the person she was now was in conflict with the person she had been, or whether they were, as she had come to suspect in the quiet hours of long shifts like this one, simply 2 rooms in the same building. She had grown up in New Mexico, not the part that people picture when they think of New Mexico, not the mountains or the art markets, but the flat, dry eastern part, near the Texas border, where the land goes on so long in every direction that you either learn to be comfortable with distance or you leave. She had learned. Her father had been a mechanic. Her mother had run the front desk of a dental practice for 20 years. They were practical, steady people who expressed love through action rather than declaration, who fixed things when they broke and did not speak much about what they felt, but made sure that what needed doing got done. Elena had absorbed this entirely. It had shaped her in ways she could still feel when she pressed against her own limits, a bedrock of utility, of doing rather than saying, that sat below everything else she had ever become. She had gone to nursing school because she was good at biology, and good with people, and because the combination of those 2 things pointed clearly in that direction. She had graduated in the top portion of her class. She had worked a civilian trauma center for 2 years, and she had been excellent at it, not in a showy way, not in the way that gets noticed at staff meetings, but in the way that the patients noticed, and the other nurses noticed, and that showed up in the quiet, accumulative record of outcomes. She had been recruited by a woman who came to the hospital one Tuesday afternoon and asked to speak with her privately. The conversation had lasted 45 minutes. Elena had asked 5 questions during those 45 minutes, which was apparently the correct number and the correct questions, because at the end of them the woman had said, "We'd like to see what you can do with a different kind of skill set." Elena had thought about it for a week. She had told no one she was thinking about it. She had sat with it in the way she sat with difficult things, quietly, methodically, turning it over, examining each face of it. Then she had said yes. The next 11 months had taken place at a facility in the high desert of New Mexico, which meant she had gone home, in a way, to learn something her home had never taught her. The altitude and the dryness were familiar. Everything else was not. She learned to be still in ways she had not previously understood stillness. Not the stillness of patience or rest, but the stillness of absolute physical control, of breathing measured and slowed, of muscle tension consciously managed, of attention narrowed to a point so fine it became, over weeks and months of practice, something closer to a sense she had not previously known she had. She learned to judge distance. Wind. The relationship between moving air and the path of a projectile over the fractions of a second that distance demands be accounted for. She qualified at 800 meters. Then she kept going. Her instructor, a man named Fowler who was in his 50s and had the face of someone who had seen all the weather, had watched her final qualification scores and said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "You've got a quiet mind. That's the thing you can't teach." She had thought about that. "I come from flat land," she said. He had nodded as if that explained something. After qualification, she had been given a cover assignment. The nursing credential, already real, was adjusted and expanded. She was placed in a medical support unit with a secondary function that existed in the space between official and unofficial, and she had carried that dual identity forward into deployments that took her to places her nursing school classmates would not have believed she had been. And then, 17 months into that posting, something had happened. Not a mission failure, not a crisis, something quieter than that and, in its way, more significant. She had received an order. The order had come through the correct channels. It had used the correct terminology. It had been accompanied by the correct level of authorization. Everything about it had been procedurally right. And she had sat with it for the 18 hours they gave her, turning it over the way she turned over difficult things. And she had come to the conclusion that procedural rightness and actual rightness were two different qualities, and that this particular order contained only one of them. She had declined. There had been consequences. Not disciplinary. She had been too careful for that. And the people who gave orders in that space were too careful themselves to make the consequence something visible and documentable. But she had been moved, reassigned to a medical posting that was entirely straightforward, where her secondary function was placed into a kind of suspension that she understood might be indefinite. She had accepted this. She had returned to nursing with the full weight of her attention. She had found, to her surprise, that coming back to it after everything that had come between was not a diminishment, but an expansion. She was better at it now, more observant, more capable of reading a situation beyond its surface. She had thought, until tonight, that the two parts of her life had separated permanently, that the order she had declined had been a kind of closing door. Standing in the bay with Marcus Drell's chart in her hands, she understood that the door had not closed. It had been waiting. The 3 phone calls she made between 5 in the morning and 6 were each very brief. She made them from the exterior of the station, in the cold, with her jacket pulled around her, and her voice kept low. The first call established that what she suspected was accurate. Marcus Drell had been taken by a private contracting organization operating under an arrangement that involved 2 governments and a level of authorization that would, if examined, reveal a chain of decision-making that nobody in that chain wanted examined. The second call was to a number she had not dialed in 14 months. It rang twice. A voice she recognized answered. "I need something located, and something reported," she said. "In that order. I can give you 6 hours." A pause. Then, "Is this active?" "It's already active," she said. "I'm managing the edges of it." Another pause. "All right." The third call was the most important and the most brief. She said, "A set of coordinates." She said a time. She said 2 words that functioned as a code she had been given 17 months ago and never expected to use. Then she went back inside and finished her shift. At 6:45, Owen, who had returned from his break, rested and cooperative, told her that a man had been asking about one of the patients at the front entrance and had been told visiting hours did not begin until 7. "Let me know when he comes back," Elena said. "He seemed impatient," Owen said. "People like that usually are," she said. At 7:15, she was in the bay when she heard the man's voice in the corridor. She had positioned herself near the monitor, her back to the entrance, and she was checking the readout when the curtain moved. She turned. The man looked different in the daylight coming through the high window, harder somehow, more definite. "He's improving," she said, before he could speak. "If you need to assess his condition, I can give you a clinical update." "I need to speak to him," the man said. "He's still not stable enough for—" "I need to speak to him," he said again. The same words, the same volume, but with something added to them that had not been there before. Marcus Drell opened his right eye. The man went still. Elena did not move from her position by the monitor. "You're awake," the man said. He recalibrated quickly. She could see it happen, the slight shift in his posture as he adjusted his approach. Marcus looked at him. His expression was entirely empty of anything readable. "Do you know where you are?" the man asked. "Medical station," Marcus said. His voice was rough. "Do you remember how you got here?" A pause, long enough to be a statement of something. "No," Marcus said. The man looked at Elena. She met his gaze with the polite attentiveness of someone who is simply doing their job. He looked back at Marcus. "We're going to get you home," the man said. "We just need to sort out a few things first. You've been through a lot, probably not thinking clearly yet." Marcus said nothing. His eye moved to the ceiling. The man waited. Then, understanding that nothing further was coming, "I'll come back later, when you've had more time to rest." He looked at Elena once more as he left. She looked back. She held the look for one additional second past comfortable, a message, slight and deniable, that she wanted him to receive. He left. She waited 15 seconds. Then she moved to the curtain and checked the corridor. Clear. She turned back to the bed. Marcus Drell was looking at her with his one open eye. The other had reduced in swelling overnight, and was partly visible now, the same color as the first, a dark gray-green, and carrying in it a quality of assessment so similar to her own that she found it almost useful, like looking at a familiar instrument. "He will be back," she said, "and he won't come alone next time." A very small pause. Then Marcus said, "How far out is your extraction?" She looked at him. The question had arrived so precisely at what she was thinking that for a moment she simply measured it. "You read it," she said, not a question. "You move like someone with range training," he said, "and you're too calm for the situation you're in, unless you know it's already handled." She said, 4 hours, maybe less." He closed his eye. "Okay. They'll ask you to confirm something before then," she said. "The man who was just here. He'll come back with more pressure, and probably with someone more senior." "I know what they want," Marcus said. "I know what they want too," she said. A pause. "I read your file," she said. "Before this, not all of it, enough." He did not open his eye, but something in his face changed, a minute shift, the kind that only registers if you are watching for it. "Then you know I don't give it up," he said. "I know," she said. "That's why I made the calls." Silence. "What's your name?" he said. "Vasquez," she said. "First name." A very small pause. "Elena." He was quiet for a moment, then, "I could only get to 650, he said, "before my rotation ended." She understood exactly what he was telling her. She adjusted the flow on his IV and made a note in his chart. 650 is good, she said. "You qualified higher," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," she said. She wrote the last of her note. She recapped her pen. She looked at him once more. "Rest," she said. "You're going to need it in about 4 hours." She left the bay and went back to her station. She sat down. She picked up her pen. Her handwriting was even. She checked her watch. Then she checked it again. 4 hours. She had been in tighter windows than this. She thought about Fowler standing on red dirt with the flat New Mexico sun behind him, watching her scores come in from 800 meters in a crosswind, and saying nothing for a long time. She thought about what he had said. A quiet mind. She went back to her charting. The station around her continued its morning routines, ordinary and familiar, containing none of what she knew was inside it. She waited. The extraction team arrived at 11:43, 17 minutes ahead of the window Elena had been given. She was ready. She had been ready since 9 in the morning, which was when the first confirmation had come back through the secondary channel, a single notation in a code that looked, to anyone who did not know what to look for, like a standard resupply confirmation. To Elena it said, "Assets confirmed. Window confirmed. Expect early." She had not told Marcus this. He had been drifting in and out of a light rest, and she had let him, because rest was doing work that medication could not do, and because what was coming would require whatever reserves he had managed to rebuild. The man in civilian clothing had returned at 10:15. He brought with him a second man, older, with the manner of someone who occupied a senior position in whatever structure they represented. This second man had attempted, with some sophistication, to conduct what was essentially an interrogation while standing in a medical bay and framing it as concern. Elena had been present for the first 8 minutes of this exchange. She had documented Marcus's vitals, adjusted his pillow, and answered 2 direct questions addressed to her, with responses that were both accurate and uninformative. Then she had excused herself to attend to another patient. Marcus had said nothing of value in those 8 minutes. She had listened from the corridor, where she could hear without being seen, and the older man's voice had shifted through several registers, reasonable, then firm, then something quieter and more deliberate that she recognized as a kind of threat delivered in pleasant language. Marcus had responded to all of it with the specific kind of cooperative vagueness that required considerable intelligence to perform convincingly. He said he was trying to remember. He said the last few days were unclear. He said he was grateful for the help. At 10:38, the 2 men left. The older one paused at the exit to the ward and spoke briefly to Patrick, who came to find Elena afterward and told her that the men were going to arrange for their own medical support to transfer the patient. When? Elena asked. This afternoon, they said. Around 2. She nodded. She thanked Patrick. She went back to the bay. 2 o'clock, she said to Marcus. He had both eyes open now. The swelling on the left had come down enough to make his face readable, and what it read was someone running continuous calculations at a speed that did not show on the surface. Your window is before that, he said. Well before, she said. And if it doesn't come, she met his gaze. It will come. A pause. But if it doesn't, she looked at him for a moment. Then she said, then I adapt. He held the look. Then something shifted in his expression. Not softness exactly, but a quality of recognition. One specific kind of person seeing the same kind in another. Adapt how, he said. That depends on what I have available, she said. I've worked in harder windows than this. He was quiet. Then he said, what made you switch? She understood the question. It did not require context. I got an order I couldn't follow, she said. So I found something I could. He absorbed this. Did they give you trouble for it? Some. Not as much as they wanted to. I was careful about how I left. You're still in it, he said. Clearly. I'm in it right now, she said. I wasn't. For a while. I thought I was done. You don't get done, he said, simply, as a statement of shared fact. She had nothing to add to that because it was exactly true. At 11:20, Owen appeared at the bay entrance and told her that a vehicle had arrived at the outer perimeter and was being cleared by the station security point. He said it was flagged as medical logistics, but that the paperwork was a type he hadn't seen before. She told him to let them through. She told him, calmly and directly, that she was going to be managing the transfer of the patient in Bay 3, and that she appreciated his work on the overnight shift, and that he should take his break now. Owen, who had the excellent quality of not needing things explained to him twice, took his break. The team that came through the station was 4 people, dressed as medical transport personnel. She had not met any of them before. She did not need to. They moved with the kind of coordinated competence that required no introduction, and the team leader, a woman named Carla, which was the one name Elena got, looked at her with a direct and practical regard that communicated everything necessary in about 3 seconds. Ready? Carla asked. Since 9, Elena said. They moved Marcus Drell out of the bay in 18 minutes. This included the time required to manage his transfer with the care his injuries demanded, which Elena supervised with complete attention because he was her patient, and his medical stability was not something she was willing to compromise for the sake of speed. They had time. She used it correctly. At 11:49, the transport vehicle was moving. Elena stood at the exterior door of the station and watched it go. She stood there for a moment in the clear morning air, and she thought about the folder she had placed in the inner pocket of her jacket, the one with the margin notation. She would pass it to the right person, through the right channel, within the next 12 hours. It would go where it needed to go, and what it said would join other documentation, and that documentation would find its way, in the slow and often frustrating process of accountability, towards something. Maybe a great deal, maybe less than it deserved. She could not control that part. She had learned, over years of operating in spaces where outcomes were never entirely in your hands, that you did the precise, specific, carefully executed thing that was yours to do, and you did it as well as it could possibly be done, and then you let it go. She went back inside. Patrick was at the front desk. He looked up when she came in. "Everything good?" he asked. "Transfer went smoothly," she said. He nodded and returned to his paperwork. She walked back through the ward to her station. She sat down. She picked up the chart she had been writing when the night had started. Was it still the same shift? It had been 36 hours now, technically 2 shifts that had merged into one long, unbroken stretch. She looked at the chart. She thought about her sister's letter, still in her bag. She thought about the elementary school classroom in Colorado, and the names of children she was coming to know. She picked up her pen. She began to write. 3 weeks after his discharge from the forward aid station, Marcus Drell sat in a room in a building in Virginia that had no sign on its exterior and gave a recorded statement to 2 people whose names he was given at the start of the session and had no particular reason to remember. He described the sequence of events that had led to his detention. He described the facility in which he had been held. He described the duration and the general nature of what had been done to him. He described the physical condition in which he had been when the extraction team arrived. He did not describe what he knew. He did not describe the coordinates and the name that the men in the facility had wanted from him, and that he had not given them. He did not describe this because he had been advised, by counsel he trusted, that describing it in this forum would constitute a disclosure that would exceed the classification of the current proceeding. He did not describe Elena Vasquez, not because he had been told not to. Nobody had told him not to. It was simply a decision he made, in the same way he made all decisions. Not impulsively, but after a period of consideration, during which he turned it over carefully and looked at all of its faces. She had not asked for his silence. She had not asked for anything. She had done what she did and sent him on his way with the straightforward manner of someone who considered the matter complete. But he understood, without needing to be told, that the space she occupied was one in which visibility carried risk, that the work she had done in that station, the calls she had made, the documentation she had collected, the management of 2 men who had come looking for him with intentions they had dressed in polite language, had been done in a way that required, going forward, a continued absence of unnecessary attention. He was good at not drawing attention to things. He gave his statement. It was thorough and accurate in every particular it covered. At the end of it, one of the 2 people in the room asked him what he most clearly remembered from his time in the aid station. He thought about this for a moment. "Someone who knew what they were looking at," he said, and stayed anyway. The person asking made a small note. "Can you be more specific?" "No," he said, and he meant it in the way he always meant things, completely, without reservation, and without any particular interest in being pushed on it. He was discharged from the session at noon. He walked out into a gray Virginia afternoon and stood on the pavement for a moment, letting his eyes adjust to the daylight. He thought about a conversation in a medical bay, the particular way someone had said 4 words, "Don't move your shoulder," and the thing underneath those words, that he had registered even at the edge of unconsciousness, the quality of someone who already knew the shape of the problem before they had finished looking at it. He thought about 847 meters. He had found out the number through a route that had required some effort and some patience, and some favors he was glad to have been in a position to call in. He had wanted to know, not because it changed anything, but because he had always believed that people deserved to be known accurately, that having an accurate picture of who someone was constituted a form of respect. She had qualified at 847 meters, under adverse wind conditions. He had known people, good people, serious people, who would have called that an extraordinary number. He thought about the way she had moved through the ward, the economy of her attention, the absolute steadiness of her hands, and he thought it was not extraordinary at all. It was exactly what you would expect, once you knew what you were looking at. He started walking. The inquiry that had been opened 3 weeks ago into the conduct of the contracting organization was proceeding in the way that such inquiries proceed, slowly, carefully, with the particular caution of institutions examining themselves. He had been told this by the same counsel who had advised him on the statement. The outcome was uncertain. It depended on documentation, on chains of evidence, on the willingness of people inside the relevant structures to allow the process to follow where it needed to go. He had no control over that. He had done what he could give. He had sat in that room and spoken the accurate truth of everything he was permitted to speak, and he had held the rest with the steadiness he had been trained to maintain under pressure. The outcome would be what it would be. He turned a corner. The afternoon was getting colder. He thought about a sealed folder. He thought about a notation in the margin of a medical chart, passed along a careful chain to the right person. He did not know if it had arrived. He did not know what it contained. He knew only what he had inferred, which was that Elena Vasquez had spent the hours between his arrival and the extraction collecting exactly the information she needed to collect, in exactly the form it needed to take, to ensure that what had happened to him could not simply be quietly absorbed and forgotten. He respected this with a directness that required no sentiment. There is a record, somewhere in a sealed file, under a classification level that would protect it from casual access for a minimum of 25 years. There is a record. It describes, in the flat and careful language of official documentation, the injuries sustained by a Navy SEAL during a detention conducted by agents of a private contracting organization operating without legal authorization. It describes the methodology. It describes what was wanted from him. It describes that he did not provide it. Attached to that record, in a separate file, is a set of documentary materials collected by a medical specialist working triage at a forward aid station. The materials include photographs, written observations, a physical description of two men who arrived and asked questions in the middle of the night, the make of their boots, the positioning of items in their pockets, as visible under ward lighting, the content of their questions, and the specific language they used. The name on that secondary file has been redacted. In its place, there is a case identifier, a number, and below the number, a single line of additional notation. It lists a training score, 847 meters, under adverse wind conditions. Nothing else is said. Nothing else needs to be.